welcome to part two. We're going to be focusing a bit on state management as well as getting some packages installed and some dependency injection and stuff like that. Now, when building an app like we're going to be doing, in a real world use case, I would probably start with authentication. It's usually like such an integral part of an app that kind of doing it first usually makes sense. However, from a learning perspective, I think it might overwhelm people because authentication is quite complicated in general. And I'm going to just focus on something a little simpler first, just to kind of figure out the pattern of block. And we will, then move on to authentication in a future video. So I do want to sort of mention a couple disclaimers. Although we'll be using block, and I like block, and I think it's great. This is not necessarily like a full block tutorial. Like someone who's never heard of block, you might have some trouble understanding some of the things here. I am going to try and make it as beginner friendly as possible, and I'm hoping even if someone hasn't touched it before, can still kind of follow along and understand. But I do recommend either watching some courses on it, reading the documentation, etc., because if I was to sort of teach you block from scratch, this video would be a lot longer. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that and sort of set the stage here. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is let's kind of get our project in a little bit better of a place for starting out. So I'm actually going to remove a bunch of things from the starter app. I'm going to keep my app for now. And in fact, no, we're going to just erase everything. We'll keep the sort of run here. And in my main.dart, we will make now just a stateless widget instead of the stateful widget that comes with the example. We'll just call it my app. And here we will just for now return a scaffold. And let's just give it a body of like center, child, text, hello. And let's just make sure, everything is still working, and we can remove these sorts of things, and hopefully we're in a good spot here. I realize I'm not running the app right now, so let me pause and start it. We are started up, and I made a critical mistake. We actually need this to be within a material app, of course. So let's just get our material app here. Instead of this, we'll just do this as home. Our material app will also need, let's give it a title, and we'll just call it clean Serverpod. And let's give it a theme. We're going to use theme data.dark just to kind of get that default sweet dark mode that we all love. I'm also going to disable the debug little banner. And I think that's good for now. So now if we actually look at it, yay, we get hello. We are in a good starting point. Oh, this should be false, not true. The whole point was to get rid of it. Okay, so let's get a bit of a folder structure figured out here. And I'm going to, within the lib folder, first of all, we're going to make a folder called core. And this is going to be where sort of our core functionality of our app lives. Anything that's kind of like a shared thing, we're going to put some stuff in there. And then we're going to make another folder called features. And this is where all our specific features will be. To me, one feature would be movie. Everything to do with movies is a feature. Another one will be auth, and so on and so forth. A lot of the times, I feel like a feature is going to align with like a database table or with a model, if you want to call it that way. So we're going to have that. And inside features, we're going to make a new folder called, let's put the auth one in here just for now. We're not going to touch it yet, but we'll also put movie in here. So that's our movie. Now, inside movie, we are using clean architecture. So what that means is we're going to have things broken into sort of three different realms. One of them is the data realm. One is domain. And one is presentation. So we'll just create those folders to get started. So the way I want you to think about the difference between these, presentation is pretty obvious. That's everything really to do with like UI. It's even where a lot of our state is actually going to be managed. It's still part of the presentation because, how the data shows up on a screen and what it's showing is still really part of presentation, even though it's not like widgets and screens. So we're going to have some subfolders in there in a moment. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have data. And you can think of data as like, this is the thing closest to like the external source. Your database, your API, your server, remote stuff, things like that. And the idea is that domain's kind of like the bridge between these in a sense. And the way we're going to be designing this is maybe in the future we move from Serverpod to Firebase. And the expectation in clean architecture is that we shouldn't have to change anything in our domain or presentation to make that change. Everything we would have to change when an external source changes is the data source. So it's like a different implementation. There'll be a lot of code changes if we're going to Firebase, but nothing will change in our presentation and nothing will change in the domain. So that's, I think, the best way I can kind of describe it, I think. And it will make more sense as we start putting things in. So I'm thinking we start at the top, we start at the data layer and kind of work our way down. However, you'll see there's going to be times we do some stuff in domain first, because you can also think of domain as kind of like the recipe book or like the pattern, the blueprint. It's like how you are designing your system to work. So there will be cases where we do that, but I'm going to try and like kind of start with data and work our way down for the most part. Okay, so within our data, we are going to make two subfolders here. Okay, so we're going to have a data sources subfolder and another folder called repositories. Then, because we will have to be doing this in a moment, inside domain, we're going to be making a repositories folder as well. And we're going to be making a use cases folder. Now, a use case is kind of like one specific task that we want to run, whether that's logging a user in or getting a list of movies in our case. And we're going to have a different file for each one. Now, just to sort of flush this out, let's get our presentation done. So we're going to have a folder called bloc in here, and that's where like anything to do with really like state management and the events and stuff like that is going to live. We're going to have pages, which, you could also call screens if you wanted to. And then we're going to have widgets, which you could also call components if you wanted to. I'm sticking, even though I like those two more, I do actually in most apps use screens and components instead of widgets and pages. I'm trying to stick, as closely as possible to what most people are doing in bloc, just to make this a little more plug and play. Okay, so we have those sort of subfolders of subfolders of subfolders. So as you can see, we have features, and then inside a feature, specific feature like movie, we have data, domain, and presentation, and then the data sources and repositories and use cases, and blocks, block, pages, and widgets right there. So although I said we're going to start with data, we are going to sort of pivot a little bit because I realized we kind of need something in place first within our domain layer. So we're going to go into domain repositories and we're going to make our movie repository. And there's a reason I'm doing this first. You'll see why in a moment. Okay, so our movie repository, and again, this is a domain layer, so this isn't really like going to be how, this shouldn't care at all whether we're using Serverpod or Firebase or Django app or anything, but it's really like how we're going to be designing our system. So what we're actually creating here is not actually really a class per se. We're creating an interface. An interface is kind of like, this is a pattern. This is what you have to follow for everything to work. So we just do abstract interface class. Abstract because this isn't something you can ever like instantiate on its own. Interface because it's really just like a pattern. It's not going to have any functionality. And class because it still is a class. And we'll call this movie repository. And within here, we're going to have a few different functions that I know we're going to need. For instance, we're going to need a way to get all the movies. So we want to design the shape of that essentially. We're going to call it list, which is like what we're going to, for listing movies. So we can essentially kind of go like movie repository.list. But we need to say, what does this actually return? And we're going to do a future. And it's ultimately going to return a list of movie. Okay, and just finish that off, and that's all good and fine, and this would work fine to start. We might also have something for retrieve, so I'll just paste this one and make retrieve, and the difference between retrieve is we'll probably be passing in an int of ID. All right, awesome. And this is great, except for the fact that things can go wrong on the internet, and with software and with everything, especially with networking, so much stuff can go wrong, right? Like the server might be down that you're talking to. Your internet might be off. Who knows? A million different things. An SSL certificate might have expired and you're just getting an error back. So we need to make sure that we're kind of handling different errors. And to do this, we are going to install a package. So we're going to do flutter pub add, and make sure you're in your Flutter directory of this entire project. And we're going to do FP Dart. Now, if you've seen some of my videos before, you've seen I've used this a lot. It's very similar to something called darts with a Z or a Z if you're not in Canada or the UK or many other places in the world. The reason I like FP Dart is it's just more recently maintained. You'll see darts is like 2 years since its last commit. FP Dart is kind of, the successor of it in some way. So now that I've installed that, what this gives us access to by importing it, and we can just import, as you would normally import something, package FP Dart, we have this new class called either. So what I can do is actually, instead of returning a list of movie, we're going to return an either. And within that, we need to say what are the things we can return. And first of all, there might be something, and I'm just going to do a string for now, just so this works, or a list of movie. And the idea is like anything on the left means something went wrong, and that's what we return when something goes wrong. Whereas on the right, this means, this is what we actually expect. It was a success, and we get back what we want. So let's actually, do the same thing here. And the difference with retrieve is we wouldn't be getting a list back, right? We'd be just getting a movie itself. So just like that. So basically, if something goes wrong, we'll return like a string with like an error message, and if something goes right, this is what would be returned. Now, I don't just want to return a string because I kind of want to make something that's more useful and can provide better functionality in the future. So what we're actually going to do is create just a very basic class that represents like an error that we're going to call failure. So inside core, because this is something that's not really feature specific, we're going to make a new folder, and we're just going to call this error. And in here, we're going to make something called failure.dart. And our failure.dart, again, is just a simple class. We'll call it failure. It's just going to have, for now, a message associated with it. So we'll also do const failure, and we'll do this.message. And we're actually going to make this an optional parameter, just in case we actually don't have a message. And if we don't have a message, we can just fall back to an unexpected error occurred, like that. So that's what we're going to use instead. And basically, we can now replace these two strings with failure and make sure we import that. We'll save everything. So that's kind of our pattern for, our repository pattern, essentially, like our blueprint for how it needs to work. But now what we want to do is we know how we are going to be, what we're interacting with here, and it's, in this case, it's Serverpod. So we're actually going to build sort of like the glue that, following this pattern, how do we actually want to interface with it? So we're going to go to data sources, and we're going to make a new file, and we're also going to call this movie repository, except we're going to write IMPL after, which is just short for implementation, because it's actually the implementation of it as opposed to what we've done before. So we're in data sources, and, you know what, I put this in the wrong spot. This should be in repositories, my mistake. Moving it to repositories, which makes sense because it's called a repository. So let's go to our implementation, and what we're going to do is make this. It's going to be called, and I'll get both of these open together just to make life a little bit easier. So we'll kind of copy this, but we'll call it IMPL as well. And it's going to implement, so not extend, but implement, because it's an interface, our movie repository. And we need to, of course, import that. Now we're seeing some errors because obviously we need to, if we look at this, it's saying, hey, you don't have these, the list one. So let's actually just click this to create the two missing overrides. And this is where we'll actually do the real work involved. So we might do something, in here that gets our list of stuff. And in here, we're going to do the code to do retrieve. Now, we're not ready to do that yet, but we at least have this sort of mapped up and ready to go. So let's actually sort of figure that out. What I want to do now is we're going to make our data sources. So in the data folder, inside data sources, we're going to make something called movie data source.dart. And we're going to start similarly where we create an abstract interface class, and we'll call this movie data source. And we're going to sort of design how this would work. And it's going to be pretty similar to what we did, again, over here. The difference is in our data source, we're not actually going to be returning an either. We're going to throw an error if something goes wrong. So basically, we're going to design it as if everything went right, and you'll see how we can fix that later. But basically we are going to have our movie, which we have to import, and we'll call this list. And we're going to have one for retrieve. And this one, the only difference is not a list, it's getting us a single movie right here. And of course, we're going to be passing in an ID whenever we want to get a movie. Then, now that we have that, we're actually going to create something called movie data source implementation. And it's going to implement, of course, our movie data source. So we've kind of designed the pattern here. This is like, if you've done stuff in, C, this is kind of like creating like your header file. Like this is the stuff that, exists. Or even things like TypeScript when you're making interfaces, like this is kind of the pattern. You like design it and then you actually implement it. So yeah, here's our data source. Now, because we're working specifically with Serverpod, there's a couple things that we are going to need. One of them is going to be a client. And this just comes from Serverpod. And we used this before in the first video. This is essentially, let me just finish this off so we can click through it. This is essentially the Serverpod client, the thing that lets us talk to the API. So that's going to be a requirement whenever we create this. Another thing we're going to be passing in, and this will be for future proofing this when we get to authentication, so we might as well do it now. We're also going to create something called a session manager. And this we need to actually import. And I just actually realized that this requires a bit of work for us to get access to, because we have to install sort of like a module on the server and on the client and stuff. So I am going to keep it here because we will need it at some point, but we're just going to comment it out and come back to it when we have authentication working. Now, the constructor here, we'll just do this, and we're going to go this.client as a required parameter. Now we're having the same sort of thing, so we can click here and go create two missing overrides. And here's where we can actually write our code that talks to Serverpod. So let's do that. So for our list, essentially what we're going to want to do is, ultimately we're going to be returning an await, so we need to make this asynchronous. And we're going to use our client.movie, and we've seen this before in our sort of example, app in the first video, but we're going to be returning this. But like I said, sometimes things can go wrong. So we're going to wrap this in a try catch, and we'll have an error here. And what we want to do is throw an error when something goes wrong. And in order to manage this, I want to do something similar to what we did with failure, where we're actually going to have a class, and we're going to call it server exception. So in that same shared folder, which is right here, we're going to make something called exceptions.dart. And for now, we're just going to have one type of exception, and it's going to be called a server exception. And this is going to implement exception, which is something that actually just exists right within Dart itself, or at least within Flutter. So we're implementing it. And then what we can do here is do final string message. And we're going to do a similar to what we did before, server exception. And we're going to require, a message you passed in. But in the case that nothing's passed in, we'll just say a problem occurred. We'll try and spell it right. There we go. Okay, so we have that now, meaning what we actually would do here is throw that server exception that we just created, and we're going to pass in a message. And we can get that by going to e.toString, because this will be an error, and we can actually just convert it to a string, and we'll get that. So similarly, we're going to do something with retrieve as well. Now, retrieve, we need to make that endpoint still. So let's actually kind of, and something I love about Serverpod is the bouncing back between the front end and the back end just feels like really good, because it's just like quick and easy, and I have it all open here. So I'm going to go to the server, and we're going to go to lib source endpoints and go to our movie endpoint again. And let's just copy the list one, because it's similar to that, and we'll call this retrieve. And instead of returning a list of movies, this will return just a single movie. And what we need to know is, what is the ID you're talking about? So we'll have an ID. So here we go this, and instead of find, we're going to use find by ID. We're going to pass in the session, and we're going to pass in that ID. So it all kind of worked, but we do have this error, and that's because technically this returns a null. It's a nullable movie. It could be null, because you might pass in a random ID of like 7 or 8 or something that doesn't exist yet, and it would just return null. So we need to mark this to basically follow that pattern, and then everything is good. So I'm going to save that. We're going to stop our server. We're going to go serverpod generate. We don't have to do any DB migrations. It was just an endpoint change. And then we'll actually see, sometimes you have to kind of like close the file, open it. There we go. It's now actually yellow. So we have retrieve. And then we actually have to pass in an ID. And of course, we have an ID here. Great. All right. So that's pretty good, but we are kind of having a similar error here. So what we can do is instead of just returning it right away, let's just make something called, I like to use the word result for these kinds of things. And also we need to make this async. And we can check if result equals null. We can then throw another error. So let's throw a server exception. And this time we're going to say, movie not found, which is really kind of like, we know that's the case. It wasn't found. We can make this a const because we're hard coding that string. It's not relying on any other variable. Otherwise, if we get past this, we can just go return result. So now we're conforming to this. This will always return a movie unless it throws an exception. And same with this. This will always return a list of movies unless it throws an exception. And that's what we kind of want on this side of things. Okay, so now let's just kind of clean some stuff up here. I'm going to save everything. I'm going to close everything because I'm getting a little overwhelmed with the things I have open. And let's step through this again. So we have our movie repository, and then we have our movie repository implementation. And we've created this data source that we can work with. So let's open our data source over here and look at here. And let us go into our implementation. And here's where we'll actually talk to our data source to do this. So in order to talk to the data source, we're going to expect that whenever we're instantiating this class somewhere in our code base, that we're passing in that client, that data source. So we're going to make a variable called final, and it's going to be a movie data source, and we'll just call it data source like this. We'll just keep it lowercase. And then we want to have a constructor here as well, where we go to, and we're going to expect that this data source is passed in. Then in our list, essentially, we are going to use our try catch again, because this will allow us to handle when that error happens, right? So we're going to try to take our data source. So we can go data source dot, and we know we have list and retrieve. In this case, we want to use list. So we're just going to, essentially, let's just say we're going to return this, but when there's an error, then we're going to return that failure class that we made. And here we can actually pass in, we know that E is, you'll see this is actually, right now, yeah, actually, sorry, one thing I missed. And we just need to kind of finish this so we can see. This is right now just an exception, but we can actually say on server exception, then we catch E, and it actually will now know that this is specifically a server exception. That way we can go e.message, because that's part of our server exception, if you remember. So we'll do that. And we know that it will be, if there's an error, at least right now, we know it's a server exception, because that's the only kind of error we're throwing. And this opens the door to, we could have different types of errors. Like we could make a 404 error, for instance, and throw it a little bit differently, and handle it a little bit differently. I'm going to keep it simple. We're just going to have one, at least for now. So we're going to return a failure. Now I'm seeing these errors. What's going on here? So it's saying it's supposed to be returning, this type is not a type of future either. Oh, right, because we need to return something that conforms to either. And what we need to do is basically kind of tell whoever's implementing this API that we're making, was it an error? Was it a left, meaning something on the left, as in the failure, or was it actually a successful thing? So in order to denote that, all we have to do is when we have success, wrap it in something called right, and do this. And we also need to await this actually because it's an asynchronous thing, which means we also need async here. So let's just do that. So we're actually returning right, and this just comes from FP Dart. So this isn't like a magic keyword in Dart or anything. It's part of the FP Dart package. And similar here, we want to say left here. And that means when we're actually talking to this endpoint somewhere else in our code, we can kind of be like, handle it. Oh, was it a success? Okay, do this. If it was a failure, maybe show a toast message of that failure or whatever we need to do for each use case. So that's how we do this. So let's copy this because it's going to be pretty similar. So here we want to do data source.retrieve, and we're going to pass in just ID here, and we're going to mark this as async. And that will basically connect it all together. All right, so we're getting somewhere here. We have a lot of our things figured out, and we're going to get the rest of it happening next. All right, the next part of the puzzle and the final part of the domain layer is going to be our use cases. So we're going to make a new use case, and we're going to have a use case for each of these things. We're going to have one called listmovies.dart, and let's have one called retrieve. movie.dart. Okay, so we'll start with the list one. And here we're going to make a class, and we're going to call it list movies use case. And this is a pattern I like, having the word use case in it. Otherwise, I find block gets a bit confusing because sometimes your state and your events and your classes all have very similar names. So I'll put use case after something, I'll put state after something, and I'll put event after something to denote the three different parts of block. So here is our use case. Now, what I want to do is I don't want to just have to write, these use cases from scratch each time. I want to find a way to make something a little bit reusable. So for that, we're going to go back to core, and we're going to make a new folder in core called use cases. And we're just going to make a file called usecase.dart. And within this, this will be a pretty simple class, but it's going to be called use case. And it's going to be an abstract class once again, and an interface. So again, we're just following that pattern, kind of like designing patterns that other things will implement. And use case is going to have two type parameters. First of all, there's going to be something called success type. And the second one we'll call params. Okay. Now, in here, we're going to have just a use case is going to have one function. You're going to call a use case. You're going to essentially invoke it. So this will generally be a future, and it's going to either work or it's not. So we want to say, a failure is going to come back as one possible thing if it fails. The second thing that could come back is the success type, meaning actually a reference to this. So this isn't something that exists. If I click on this, it's doesn't go anywhere. Same with this. I'm just calling these. This is similar to using something like T, but we have more than one thing, so we have to give it a different name. So there we have that. So it's actually going to allow us, when we're creating a use case, to actually set different success types, because otherwise we would just be creating these all individually. So we're using generics. It's cool. Then we're going to create a call function, and the call function will take one parameter, and it's going to be whatever the params we pass in as a generic are. If this isn't making any sense right now, it will when we actually do it, hopefully. I also want to make a class called no params, because sometimes some of these functions, and the list one specifically, it actually doesn't take any parameters. So we're actually just going to make this class here so that we can use it in other places. Again, will make more sense probably when we do it. Okay, so back in our use case now, we're going to go and we're going to implement our use case model that we just made. Use case. I need to learn how to spell implements use case, so let's import that. And here we want to show, and we'll just open up use case to remember how this is. We need to say what was the success type, and in the case of listing movies, the success is actually getting a list of movie back. Let's import in movie. The second parameter of this is going to be what parameters are actually used, and this is our first time using no params. Because when we're listing a movie, until we start adding things like filtering and stuff like that, we're not actually having any params. We're just give me the movies. We're not give me the movies that start with the letter T. So we don't have to pass any params, so we're using this no params option that we made. Now, anytime our use case is implemented in our code, we're going to be passing in our movie repository. We're not passing in, technically we are, but we're not marking this as movie repository implementation, because in theory we could have multiple implementations. Maybe we actually build an app that has has Firebase implementation and a Supabase implementation and whatever and Serverpod implementation, and we want this to work either way. So what we're passing in is kind of this generic abstract class, and anything that is implementing the movie repository will be able to be passed in here. So we'll just call this movie repository. Then we need to make the constructor for this, so list movies use case, and we will go this.movie repository. Then you're going to see another error. Okay, cool. This is what's great about sort of using implementations and stuff, because you don't really forget things. Dart will yell at you. Quick fix, sure, let's create it. So here's our call method, which it already knows it's going to be list movie because it actually took it from here. It's very smart, and it knows that no params are there. So super awesome. I don't know if that's Dart doing that or VS Code doing that. I'm not quite sure, but it's amazing, and it just works really well. And here is where we will take our movie repository. We're going to go return await movie repository dot list. Okay, and we have to make this async, of course. Though it forgot one thing. It would have been nice if it just let us do that, if it did that automatically. But here we go. So it's cool because we're not actually like doing anything here. We're not putting this in a try catch. We're not doing anything because we've already done that upstream, right? We already have, if we were to step through all this, we would see that we're already kind of handling that. And it's already, if we looked at this, and sometimes it's nice just to make a temporary variable, because you actually see, oh, this is going to return an either failure or list of movies, meaning we don't have to like make a variable and then return it. We can very easily just return it here. Okay, and we'll just get rid of that. Import, I'm just going to import the proper way. Sometimes the auto imports import, you know, not the best thing, and let's just do it that way. Okay, so we have our list movies use case. Let's duplicate this again and make our retrieve movie use case. So I'm just going to kind of like rename this to retrieve movie, single movie. And in this case, it's going to not give you a, it's not going to be a list of movies, it's going to be a movie, and we will have params here. So what I like to do is then we make a class in here called params, and actually, like, you know, sometimes it's good to make it kind of based on this. So we can use retrieve movie params. And what we want is an int of ID. And similarly, we need to make a constructor, and we'll just say required this.id. So these are the params that are going to be expected when the use case is being used, and in which case we actually change this to here, then we go retrieve, and what's this saying? It's saying, oh, it's expecting an ID, so we just go ID, but to get the ID, how do we get it? Oh, params.id. All right, and this is not decorated correctly, and that's just because we copy and pasted some stuff without thinking about it. So now we're actually doing that, and you know, to prove that this is correct again, I can just make, you know, a temporary variable, and if we scroll over, it's like either a failure or a movie. Great. You'll notice it's not going to be a null movie. We'll never get a null movie back successfully. It'll become a failure if for some reason the movie is null, and that's just really handy. We don't really have to, you know, even worry about like different states of, oh, did it work, but was there a movie? No, it didn't work. You didn't get a movie. You're either getting a movie or you're getting a full-on this failed, and that's the pattern we want to do. Okay, so we have our use cases set up. We have our data sources set up. We have a repository set up. So that kind of covers everything in the data and the domain layer. In the next video, we will be getting into the presentation layer, starting with the block part of things, which will allow us to create events and states, and obviously the block itself. And then also in that video, we're going to be setting up our dependency injections, as well as just getting block installed. We haven't even installed it yet, even though we've done all this stuff, and so on and so forth. And we should, by the time of the next video, we should have a movie list working, and probably also a retrieve, since we have most of the code done for that. So thanks for sticking in this so long. This is just part 2. There's going to be quite a few more parts, just as a warning, but it's all good stuff, and I hope you're learning a lot, not just about Serverpod, but about functional programming and about clean architecture. And see you in the next one.